Good afternoon, everyone. I want to wish you a happy daylight savings time, especially to all of you who celebrate. I don't. I'm Stephen Nelson, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 74th A.W. Mellon Lecture in the Fine Arts by Dr. Mabel Wilson, titled America's Architecture of Freedom and Unfreedom. Over the next 4 weeks, over the next 4 Sundays, Dr. Wilson will present key themes and examine buildings, works of art, and other historical documents through the interplay of race and the construction of national identity. Dr. Wilson will be introduced by Kaywin Feldman, Director of the National Gallery. Kaywin, come on up.
Thank you, Stephen. As my husband and I were driving here, we saw people in winter coats and then a guy in shorts. So it's that time of year as we are switching into spring, which I know we're all very much looking forward to. And so even with the sunny day outside, we're really glad you're here, and thank you for joining us this Sunday. I'm Kaywin Feldman, Director of the National Gallery, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's event, the 74th A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts. Inaugurated in 1949, the Mellon Lectures is the longest running lecture series at the National Gallery. The series was founded, quote, to bring to the people of the United States the results of the best contemporary thought and scholarship bearing upon the subject of the fine arts. The program itself is named for Andrew W. Mellon, the museum's founder, who gave the nation his art collection and the funds to build the museum, which opened to the public in 1941. The A.W. Mellon Lecture Series features the fine arts and also intersects with other disciplines and histories. Over the years, the series has welcomed art historians, artists, archaeologists, poets, and musicologists, each offering profound insights into how and why the arts matter. Before introducing this afternoon's lecturer, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Stephen Nelson, the Dean of the Gallery Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, which organizes the lecture series, as well as Associate Dean Kyra Cabañas, and the center and gallery staff who've made today's program possible. And now on to our esteemed speaker. Her scholarship is not confined to the page. Dr. Wilson's work extends into architectural practice, public curation, and activism. In 2021, she co-curated the exhibition Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She's a founding member of the collaborative Who Builds Your Architecture, an advocacy group addressing labor ethics in global building practices. Her contributions to the field have earned her numerous accolades, including the National Building Museum's Vincent Scully Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Elsa Mellon Bruce Senior Fellowship at the National Gallery's Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. A leader in the field of architectural history, a deeply engaged architect, and a connector of architects and scholars working on an international scale, Dr. Wilson's multifaceted practice has had a wide impact, and that impact continues to grow. Her work is extraordinary for its rigor as well as for its commitment to pushing our concept of architecture, both in scholarship and in practice. Wilson pressures us to reassess how we understand the intersections of architecture and our social lives. From the archive to the studio to the streets, Wilson's goal is nothing short of a complete redefinition of architecture in social, cultural, and political terms. Today is the first of her 4-part lecture series, America's Architecture of Freedom and Unfreedom, which will be presented in this auditorium and online every Sunday until March 30th, 2025. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that my remarks were printed on 2-sided pages, and I just missed a whole page. can't short Dr. Wilson, so excuse me, but I'm going to go back to introducing this year's Mellon Lecturer, Mabel O. Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the Nancy and George Rupp Professor of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, where she also serves as a professor of African American and African diasporic studies. Her interdisciplinary research challenges traditional narratives in architectural history, shedding light on how the built environment has both reflected and shaped racial ideologies in the United States. She's the author of the widely acclaimed Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums from 2012, which examines the role of African American representation at world's fairs and exhibitions. Her book, Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture from 2016, chronicles the long and complex journey that led to the creation of this landmark museum, analyzing both its historical significance and its architectural design. Currently, Dr. Wilson is working on her highly anticipated project, Building Race and the Nation, Slavery, Dispossession, and the U.S. Civic Architecture, which investigates how race, slavery, and colonization have influenced the construction of civic buildings in the United States. So, sorry for the switcheroo there, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Mabel O. Wilson to the lectern.
Thank you. Thank you all. Good afternoon. Thank you. And welcome and thank you for those who are here in person and also folks who are online on this beautiful Sunday afternoon at the National Gallery of Art's East Wing Auditorium by celebrated architect I.M. Pei. It's my favorite Pei building, actually. And I've always admired the way Pei and his team selected the same Tennessee pink marble of the West Wing to sculpt the trapezoidal prisms of the modernist East Wing. Places, after all, are important because they have stories to tell us. Poring over places for traces of hidden and lost histories, whether they be buildings or ruins or landscapes or place names, or perhaps found in art or literature or film, reminds me of what Smithsonian Secretary Dr. Lonnie Bunch shared when I interviewed him for my book, Begin with the Past. From his manifold experiences as a historian, curator, and founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Dr. Bunch believes that Black history often, quote, hides in plain sight, end quote. Now, he was referring in part to the ironwork, for example, by skilled, enslaved, and free Black ironmongers that embellished the antebellum buildings in Charleston and New Orleans. Now, it was this invisible architectural detail by Black craft workers that became the central motif for the corona, the metal lattice structure that hovers on the museum's exteriors, which you can visit just down the way in the National Mall. Now, my next 4 lectures will present invisible histories by taking you on a journey into and across a multitude of public spaces and intimate domestic realms foundational to how our shared national narrative took shape. My ambition is that we think together about what architecture and art can reveal about the histories of the social contract that binds us and the complex meaning of the humanist values that define how we see and know the world around us. So my thanks to Director Feldman for that lovely introduction. And then also my gratitude to Dean of the Center, Dr. Stephen Nelson, an extraordinary historian of art and the Black experience, for the generous invitation to deliver this year's Mellon Lectures in Fine Art. I count the previous brilliant scholars and artists. When I saw that list, I was quite intimidated, who have delivered these prestigious Mellon Lectures, like last year's incomparable Anna DeVere Smith, as important influences on my own scholarship and practice, and a few are mentors, colleagues, and friends. I also want to extend a welcome to the Center's fellows who join us here today, and to the Center's phenomenal staff whose efforts allowed me to prepare and arrive here with ease, and I share my deep appreciation. I also want to thank my ASL interpreter this afternoon for making the lecture accessible to a wide audience. So these 4 presentations would not be possible without the catalyst of a fellowship awarded here at the Center when I was the Elsa Mellon Bruce Senior Fellow in 2015-2016. Then Dean Elizabeth Cropper, who is in the audience, a titan in the scholarship of Baroque art in Italy and France, shared invaluable insights on neoclassicism's architectural forms that are foundational to these talks. This was not an area that I would typically work in as a scholar, in fact. I also want to thank Peter Luckhart and Teresa O'Malley for their intellectual and professional generosity while I was at the Center. I was also fortunate to be surrounded by a really remarkable cohort of Center Fellows that year. And in particular, I just want to thank and call out the work of historians Angela Miller and Paul Jascott, who's in the audience, whose respective research on marginal cadres of queer artists and vulnerable Jewish communities during the Holocaust provided an invaluable model for ethical scholarship, especially for how to study with care the struggles of one's historical actors. Now, over the course of the 4 Mellon Lectures, I am deeply honored and humbled to share my deep archival exploration in the poignant stories of the places where people and communities lived, loved, labored, and struggled more than 200 years ago. I dedicate these lectures to my 4th great-grandparents, Winnie Mills, and Daniel Cooper, and an unknown enslaved woman whose son was Alfred Brown Wilson. Now, because all 3 were born enslaved in the early 1770s in the eastern counties of British North Carolina, in their youth, they witnessed the turmoil that fomented revolution and the birth of a novel experiment in modern Republican democracy, a union of states that in the end could not acknowledge their humanity nor grant them their freedom. Podium, audience, I feel like I'm teaching. But I want to say, I've taught this very curious late 18th century painting for many years to architecture students in courses from urban theory to our current long 19th century architectural history survey at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Now, its artist, US-born, London-trained Samuel Jennings, is a skilled painter, but not a remarkable one. Like his peers, the portraitists Gilbert Stuart, John Singleton Copley, and Charles Wilson Peale, who each have several paintings in the National Gallery's collection. Observe, for example, how Jennings' muse towers over the other main figures. Objects and people and his mise en scène are clumsily proportioned and somewhat awkwardly detailed. But all that aside, what Jennings' tableau does offer is a rare and fascinating portrait of an emerging self-governing democratic republic wrestling with the moral dimensions and spatial dynamics of the institution of enslavement, one at odds with its bedrock principles of freedom and equality. Liberty, liberty displaying the arts and sciences, or the genius of American, encouraging the emancipation of the Blacks from 1792, hung in the gallery opposite the entrance to the Library Company's new building on 5th and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia. That recently completed building, designed by William Thornton, who you see on the right, in a lovely painting by Gilbert Stuart, well done. Thornton was a British physician, a Quaker from Tortola, the island, and an enslaver, who shortly thereafter completing this building would become one of the architects of the US Capitol and a future commissioner of public buildings for what was then called Washington City in the District of Columbia. And I talked more about Thornton actually in my 4th lecture. Now, because of its Quaker roots, Philadelphia was one of the first to abolish slave trading and slaveholding. And the library's directors wanted a painting that extolled the virtue of the natural rights of all men. Jennings, a Philadelphia native living in London, painted the large canvas at the behest of the directors, who asked that the painting feature perhaps the Roman goddess of justice and law, Minerva, or the Roman goddess of liberty, Libertas, displaying the wisdom of the democratic values found in their collection to, quote, Negroes sitting on the earth or in some attitude expressive of ease and joy, end quote. Great. So let's unpack the painting's allegorical scene. The central figure, a luminous liberty whose feet still bear the broken chains of enslavement, symbolizes the promises of a liberated mind and body. She holds in her hand the library's catalog that rests upon a volume of philosophy enabling intellectual self-improvement, and below that a volume on agriculture, ensuring physical sustenance and economic vitality. Now, Liberty wraps her arm around a symbolic rod used to grant Roman slaves manumission. A pileus, a felt clap worn by emancipated Roman slaves, sits atop the rod. Now, near Liberty, the globe represents geography. The lyre signifies arts and music, and the score of Handel's Come Ever Smiling Liberty drapes volumes of Milton and Shakespeare. Scattered elsewhere, we find a painter's palette atop a scroll of heraldry. A column fragment symbolizes antiquity and history. As for the sciences, they are represented by the tools for drawing geometric forms, a drawing of mechanical devices, and an astronomer's telescope. Some believe actually it's a telescope used by the great scientist and surveyor, Rittenhouse. Now, Jennings' neoclassical temple of enlightenment, an orderly space, note the gridded floor, safely housed the West's archive of knowledge. Now, peripheral to that space, a family of formerly enslaved Africans, or Negro as they were called then, an unusual scene that some scholars argue was perhaps the first depiction of a Black family to appear in an American painting. A mother, father, and two children bow in appreciation of the power and wisdom emanating from liberty. Their newly emancipated community celebrate around a liberty pole amidst the plenitude of nature. Here we see Negroes sitting on the earth, as had been requested by the directors. Now, it is precisely as Jennings' articulation of the split between the modern world of Euro-Americans and the so-called primitive world of Africans that piqued my interest in this painting. But equally curious is how Jennings deploys architecture that melds together the spheres of arts and science to delineate the difference between the interior world of reason, culture, signified by whiteness, and the exterior realm of the senses, nature, signified by Blackness. Now, upon closer inspection, Jennings' allegorical narrative holds an important message from the burgeoning abolitionist community in Philadelphia. Where should Blacks live once they're liberated from enslavement? Should they remain in the US or move elsewhere? Now, a clue can be found in the bust that is in the scene, believed to be either British banker and economist Henry Thornton, no relation to the architect, or renowned British politician or abolitionist William Wilberforce. Both men were involved in the formation of the Sierra Leone colony beginning in 1787, which was established on the lands of the Temne along the West African coast to receive free blacks and former slaves who self-deported from the British Empire. The ships on the Schuylkill River in the background may have been included as vessels waiting to set sail for the African coast, a prospect that many free blacks, including Philadelphia's well-organized community, would roundly object to with Liberia's formation in the 1820s. And the fierce debate around this I will explore actually in my fourth lecture. Now, Jennings' allegorical painting was but one catalyst for the ongoing project upon which my 4 lectures are based. The book examines how America's burgeoning landscape of liberty and freedom was for many of its enslaved and free Black population a landscape of tyranny, to quote architectural historian Lewis P. Nelson. Noble scenes of democratic action doubled as what scholar Saidiya Hartman calls harrowing scenes of subjection. In locating the unrelenting oppression of the enslaved in the spatial division of the nation's modern social order, Hartman queries, quote, "If the public realm is reserved for the bourgeois citizen and subject, and the private realm is inscribed by freedom of property ownership and contractual republic wrestling with the moral dimensions and the spatial dynamics, the contractual transactions based upon free will, then in what space is the articulation of the needs and the desires of the enslaved at all possible?" Now, acutely aware of their conditions of unfreedom, enslaved and free Blacks, I want to suggest in what follows, formed counter geographies of resistance and community. That geography entwining freedom and captivity, one inscribed into the public spaces and private homes of the new capital, Washington City, and elsewhere like Richmond, Virginia, and beyond, as I will explore, illustrates how the yoke of slavery stifled the aspirations of democracy in the nation's first 9 decades, until its irreconcilability erupted in discord and disunion in a deadly civil war that waged across the nation's 33 states. Now, on the ground, early architects like William Thornton, Thomas Jefferson, James Hoban, Benjamin Henry Latrobe, and others, and these are not trained professionals as we understand today, but they designed and built the state houses and official residence that facilitated the modern experiment in governance by the people in the late 18th and early half of the 19th century, first half of the 19th century. These new monuments to the core values of democracy employed an array of workers, free white and indentured laborers, along with enslaved laborers like the carpenter Peter, the free Black laborers Louis Fortune, Jerry Holland, and James Dant, all of whom I will talk about. But to tell this particular story of US civic architecture necessitated the examination of the buildings and drawings and correspondences of architects. But to delve into their complex relationship with slavery and the enslaved required following archival traces in personal letters, work ledgers, payroll documents, runaway slave advertisements, slave tax rolls, and census records where personhood and kinship were violently eradicated to render men, women, and children as fungible, that is, exchangeable property to be bought and sold. An important part of my research has been to examine closely artworks like Jennings and others like Edward Savage, which I'll talk about in my second lecture, to ask how and why did the declared freedom for some rely upon conditions and unfolded within spaces of unfreedom for others. Now let us unpack for a moment the formation of the racial paradigm of human difference that comes to be known as race by the mid-19th century. And I think what attracted me to this period is precisely because whatever race means was very much in process and unstable. Now, with nationalism growing in the West in the closing decades of the 18th century, Europeans continued to develop the racial paradigm of human difference, one that emerged from centuries of contact with and colonial expansion into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. During the revolutionary period and shortly thereafter, race had not yet been categorized into hierarchical terms of biological variations and evolution, as would happen under the disciplines of modern science in the mid-19th century. Natural philosophers and natural historians of the period, among them Immanuel Kant, Jean-Louis Leclerc, and Thomas Jefferson, as we shall see shortly, debated the meanings of the human species' observable physical variations or outer character and perceived mental distinctions, such as temperaments or inner character. Their observations and experimentations sought to uncover the laws, climatic or geographic, that govern the differentiations in the human species across the globe. Now, Kant, in Observations on the Feelings of the Beautiful and Sublime from 1764, scrutinized the national character to be observed in Africans, writing that, quote, "The Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above the trifling," end quote, adding, quote, "Although many of them have set free, not a single one was ever found who presented anything great in art and science or any other praiseworthy quality," end quote. Now, at the same time, natural rights per John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau became foundational for how nation states, whose governments, guided by historically derived ideas of democracy, ensured freedom for their citizens. Moreover, natural historians and scientists develop representations of time and space in the emerging modern disciplines of history and science that place non-white peoples in prehistory in regions unexplored in regions unexplored in colonial maps. Now, according to art historian David Beinman, the term race was but one term of human variety, along with the term nation and also the term variety. Beinman argues that aesthetic judgments of beauties signified by whiteness and ugliness signified by blackness played different roles for how the Enlightenment ideals of racial difference emerged in the 18th and early 19th century. It is important to keep in mind that from the 15th century onwards, secular reason also had an impact on Europe's arts of building, on building's transformation from a medieval trade guild, to a modern discipline of architecture. With the rise of academies and learned societies, architectural treatises like the ancient writings of Vitruvius and the works of Andrea Palladio circulated debates on the appropriate use of proportions, of classical elements, and the ideal configuration of building types. These technical and aesthetic developments in Europe gave rise to the figure of the modern architect. And at first, self-taught elites like Jefferson and Thornton, but eventually apprentice-trained European architects like Hoban and Latrobe were employed by the state and private citizens to design a range of buildings, from government buildings, banks, we have custom houses, storehouses, libraries, museums, theaters, prisons, great houses, plantations, and churches that symbolized regimes of power and organized the territorial dynamic between the metropole and the colony and the city and country. Born into the wealthy planter class of the Piedmont region of British colonial Virginia, Jefferson, a revered statesman, lawyer, naturalist, architect, planter, and slave owner, epitomized the humanist polymath. Jefferson possessed several key folios of Palladio and other volumes on Greek and Roman antiquities. Now, he had experimented with Palladian neoclassicism at Monticello, his plantation house in the Piedmont, and on unbuilt designs for his alma mater, the College of William and Mary. Analyzing Jefferson's architecture and his writings, as I will focus on the rest of this lecture, broadens our understanding of the social, economic, and cultural and political context in which the first work of American civic architecture, the Virginia State Capitol, was realized. Now, Jefferson wrote Notes on a State of Virginia, a lengthy compendium of the state's geography, geology, wildlife, human inhabitants, and political economy, during the same years that he designed Virginia's Capitol building. One astute deliberation on the moral peril of slavery, still tempered by the belief in the natural inferiority of the Negro's mind and body, was an appraisal of the aesthetic and intellectual value of works by enslaved poet Phillis Wheatley in Notes on a State of Virginia that was published in 1785. And yet, free, Black, and enslaved laborers helped construct his state house, a model for future civic buildings. And so, because his extensive oeuvre encompasses the aesthetic and technical domain of architecture, the political realm of government, and the rational sphere of natural philosophy and history, these two works by Jefferson offer an ideal lens through which to understand the intersections of the emerging discourses of architecture, nationalism, and racial difference as they coalesced in the late 18th century. And I always love this image of of all of the things that's why he is a remarkable polymath. Like all of the things that he did, he clearly did not have the distraction of cell phones and so on. Or reality TV, for that matter. So in May 1798, newly immigrated British architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe painted several watercolors of Virginia's new Capitol building in Richmond. In translucent hues, one of the watercolors depicted the stately white temple in the distance, sitting nobly atop Shockoe Hill, overlooking the town's sparsely populated pastoral landscape. One of the earliest examples of American civic architecture, the Capitol building, which had been mostly completed and prepared for the arrival of legislators, staff, and servants in 1788, was designed by Thomas Jefferson and modeled in part on the Maison Carrée, a first-century Roman temple in Nîmes, France. In 1776, 20 years before Latrobe's arrival, Virginia had drafted and ratified its state constitution, of which Jefferson had been a key author. The document established a separation of powers that would go on to become the model for the organization of the new federal government. The new building envisioned by Jefferson in 1776 to house the state's governmental functions needed to both symbolize and enable the power of the people to govern and adjudicate the laws of the new state. Jefferson also intended the state capitol to serve as a model for civic architecture throughout the 13 states, as well as in the yet-to-be-determined seat of the federal government, which will be the topic of the 3 forthcoming Mellon Lectures. Now, a survey of the population of the port town of Richmond reveals its racial contours of who is free and not free. The city's white residents, who were America's newly minted citizenry, staffed and served in its government seat. patronized its taverns, shops, stables, and inns, profited from its docks along the James River and from its warehouses trading in tobacco, wheat, and slaves. And they lived in the wood frame houses in the east side of Richmond, shown in the foreground of Latrobe's watercolor. Now, among the several thousand white Americans, including Europeans like Latrobe, living in Virginia in the late 18th century, labored an almost equal number of non-citizens, free and enslaved African men, women, and children, who served their masters and their mistresses to produce the region's great wealth. From the city's domestic interiors to its public and civic spaces, it is important that we understand how the people of Virginia, and by extension, the people of the United States of America, were imagined and defined during this period of revolutionary action and post-revolutionary planning. In other words, who were Virginians and US citizens endowed with constitutional rights and protections, and who were not. Now, in Jefferson's bill, and in his initial drawings of the state capitol, all of the components of the new republic, executive, legislative, and judicial, were accounted for, with each branch placed in its own building on Richmond's Shockoe Hill. Now, for the state capitol, Jefferson placed the House of Delegates and other offices on the lower level. The Senate chambers, associated clerks, and other legislative functions were located on the upper level. Astutely aware of architecture's ability to project the stability of the state, Jefferson believed that the new Capitol and courthouse building should be, quote, built in a handsome manner with walls of brick or stone and porticos, end quote. A neoclassical exterior that echoed the architecture and ideals of Roman republicanism and Athenian democracy would best speak to the new country's values of liberty and justice. Jefferson, as scholars have noted, distilled many lessons from classical political philosophy. But he warned his fellow citizens of the deleterious defects in ancient Roman republicanism that led to authoritarianism and collapse. Nor were British constitutional and legislative models acceptable. These precedents led to despotic, fundamentally undemocratic forms of rule, precisely what colonists in Virginia had rebelled against. And yet, the architecture of Rome and Britain's social and political institutions could serve as models from which to build a new architecture for the state and the nation. Now, to house Virginia's new government, in Jefferson's estimation, construction practices needed to evolve beyond the production of crude, ugly, wooden, and awkwardly proportioned brick buildings that were found in Williamsburg, the colony's previous seat of government. Jefferson insisted that brick and stone were the proper materials for public buildings because of their longevity. However, Virginia lacked craftsmen and workmen trained to draw and execute correctly the classical orders of entablatures, pediments, and columns. This perceived lack of skilled labor was the outcome that one segment of the construction workforce were enslaved men and boys who could not be taught by custom and law to read and write. Now, in 1784, Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as the ambassador to France, a post he held for 5 years. During most of his diplomatic assignment in Paris, he lived in the elegant Hotel de Langeac on the Champs-Élysées with his 2 daughters, Martha and Maria. To tend to their needs, Jefferson bought the enslaved siblings, James, his chef, and Sally Hemings, as a nursemaid to his children. Both were half-siblings to Martha Wales Jefferson, his recently deceased wife. And Annette Gordon Reed's two superb histories of the Hemings can give you sort of insights on these complex histories and relationships. Now, to complete plans for the Virginia capital and for notes on the state of Virginia, while living in Paris, Jefferson may have regularly utilized one of his traveling desks. Over the course of his life, Jefferson designed and commissioned several lap desks, including ones made by enslaved craftsman John Hemings, half-sibling to Sally and James, that he often gifted to family and friends. These desks were typically made of fine mahogany, with storage for paper, quills, and ink, and a compartment for a portable copy press that allowed Jefferson to make duplicates of his letters and documents. Record keeping for Jefferson, like his interest in collecting books and arts and ethnographic and geological artifacts, attests to a keen archival and taxonomic sensibility that underwrote notes on a state of Virginia. Now, in the summer of 1785, two of Virginia's directors of public buildings, James Buchanan and William Hay, sent Jefferson revised plans for the Capitol's foundations for Jefferson to review as a means of quelling discontent in the state legislature over the choice of the building site. So these are what were sent, and it's kind of like an office building. There's a hallway and, clearly offices on either side, totally lacking the sort of elegance that Jefferson had in his designs. So, with construction commencing, Jefferson needed to act quickly to refine his plans and complete his superior designs. To assist with the preparation of drawings and a model, he recruited French architect Charles-Louis Clerisseau, a skilled draftsman and archaeologist. Now, Jefferson had reviewed the drawings of the perfectly preserved Maison Carrée in books and greatly admired Clerisseau's publication, The Antiquities of France. Now, Clerisseau's meticulous documentation of the temple's details and proportions and layout suited Jefferson, who possessed not only the eye of an architect, but the fastidious gaze of a naturalist. And because legislatures desired to conduct all of the business of the state in one structure, Jefferson and Clerisseau revised the earlier plans and placed the general court on the first floor across from the state's lower chamber, the House of Delegates. On the second floor, housed the Senate chambers and auxiliary spaces for the clerks. And the new design took advantage of the basilica form so that the protocols of assembly, deliberation, and adjudication adapted from the colonial government would operate smoothly in the new space. Now, in a letter to his fellow Virginian state representative and planter, James Madison, Jefferson expressed his desire that the Capitol building would become a model of architecture worth emulating throughout the new nation. Quote, "How is a taste in this beautiful art to be formed in our countrymen unless we avail ourselves of every occasion when public buildings are to be erected, of presenting them with models for their study and their imitation," end quote, that he asked of his friend Madison. Jefferson went on to write that the purpose of his novel design was, quote, "to improve the taste of my countrymen, to increase in its reputation, to reconcile to them the respect of the world, and to procure them its praise," end quote. So the rationale for replicating historical buildings held in high regard, like the Maison Carrée, was, quote, "very simple. but it is noble beyond expression and would have done honor to our country as presenting to travelers a morsel of taste in our infancy, promising much for our mature age," end quote. So Jefferson's proposed designs would offer citizens an invaluable primer on how architecture could represent the virtues of durability, utility, and beauty. And he commissioned the model maker Jean-Pierre Fouquet to complete a plaster maquette of his design. And in June of 1786, he shipped the model, along with Clarisseau's drawings, to Hay and Buchanan in Richmond. Now, certainly, one of the challenges faced by Virginians and the new Union of 13 states was how to cultivate the character of its new political subjects, the people. In 18th century Europe and its colonies, refined taste in art, dress, architecture, and food in particular fueled by the growing appetite for colonial products of sugar and tea and coffee and tobacco, became a marker of elevated intellectual and economic status. This popular culture of taste, writes scholar Simon Giocondi, also harbored, quote, repressive tendencies, namely the attempt to use culture to conceal the intimate connection between modern subjectivity and the political economy of slavery, end quote. Importantly, the interdependence between a new American culture, one that included architecture, and the enslavement of African peoples, justified by their presumed innate mental and physical inferiority, can be found in Notes on a State of Virginia, which Jefferson wrote in the same period that he designed Virginia's statehouse. Now, Notes on a State of Virginia originated as a report prepared in response to 23 queries sent to Jefferson in 1780 by a French diplomat, Francois Barbé Mabois, who created the survey to better understand the geographic and historic character of the newly formed United States. In Notes, Jefferson took stock of the state's natural features and human inhabitants. His taxonomic assessments of plants, animals, minerals, climates, rivers, mountains, and caves highlighted the state's bountiful resources. He noted that natural laws also govern the human species residing within the state's boundaries and divided them into Linnaeus's racial taxonomies of Europeans, Aboriginals, and Africans. Now, the book's latter chapters reviewed the state's systems and institutions, namely its commerce, government, religion, and civil society. Intimately familiar with Virginia's Constitution, Jefferson's outlined the government's branches and duties, noting in detail the rights and laws that adjudicated the legal status and relationships, albeit unequally, between the three aforementioned races. In his response to Query 14, Administration and Justice and the Description of the Laws, Jefferson sought a political solution of what to do with the Black population living in Virginia, the majority of which was enslaved. And on several occasions in state legislation and in early drafts of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson had proposed terminating the importation of slaves into Virginia and the United States. And later, during his presidency, he abolished the international slave trade in 1808, but not its lucrative domestic market. Now, along with political concerns, Jefferson also held quote, moral and physical objections, end quote, to Blacks based on a lifetime of observations of their physiques and character. Over the course of his life, Jefferson enslaved about 600 men, women, and children at his plantation, Monticello, and his other properties, with typically 130 enslaved persons who worked in the household and on the various farms and manufactures of Monticello. Under Jefferson's probing gaze, the features of the Black body were seen as less beautiful in comparison to the symmetry and flowing hair of white physiques. An even more important measure of intellect was the Negro's supposed inability to appreciate beauty, except in the most central manner, or to create works of true aesthetic value, except out of mimicry. This provided Jefferson with additional evidence of their natural mental inferiority. As stated in Query 14, Jefferson observed, quote, in imagination, they, Negroes, are dull, tasteless, and anomalous, end quote. Now, to affirm his observations, Jefferson offered the examples of composer, writer Ignatius Sancho, and poet Phillis Wheatley, whose books Jefferson had in his library. But why single out Wheatley for derision, given that her poetry engaged in the same sphere of arts and letters, one shaped on one hand by the Enlightenment's classical forms of political discourse, and on the other by the moral imperatives of Christianity? A little about Wheatley's story. In 1761, an 8-year-old girl was purchased as a domestic servant by a Boston family. Her enslavers named her Phillis, after the slave brigantine Phillis that had transported her from Senegambia. And as their property, she was given their last name of Wheatley. The family were evangelical Christians whose belief emphasized an emotional connection to God and promoted congregational autonomy. So to achieve that bond, literacy, the ability to read the Word of God, was essential, even for the enslaved. The household's daughter, Mary, tutored Phillis's classical education. She learned English, then mastered reading in Greek and Latin, a rare educational opportunity for an enslaved person, one outlawed in most part of the British colonies for fear that a slave who could read posed an imminent danger. Inspired by the classical verses of Homer and the neoclassical poems of Milton and Alexander Pope, Phillis began to write poetry, publishing her first poem in the Newport Mercury in 1767. Now, Phillis lived in the Wheatley's house on Boston's King and Mackerel Street. There are no descriptions of the house, particularly its interior layout or how daily life unfolded for young Phillis. Now, one example that approximates the Wheatley's domestic milieu is an embroidered work from 1783 by Prudence Punderson, a free white woman who also lived in New England in Preston, Connecticut. Now, Punderson crafted with silk thread and cloth an arc of her birth, life, and death within the intimate spaces of a New England household. In her tableau, she depicts herself drawing at a tea table, similar to the one in Wheatley's portrait. Punderson placed herself sitting between a wooden crib, holding a baby, and a drop-leaf table upon which sat a coffin embellished with P.P. Around her, she gathers cherished possessions, which included an enslaved girl who sits dutifully watching a sleeping baby Prudence. These domestic possessions served as props to stage an allegory of Punderson's own mortality. For the frontispiece of her book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, rather than portray Phillis as a prop in the Wheatley's family tableau, which in fact as property she was, she is depicted as a young poet sitting at a tea table deep in her own thought and immersed in her craft. Believed to be made by fellow Black Bostonian Scipio Moorhead, this engraving was a radical portrayal of Black self-fashioning within a white New England household and within a slave-owning British North American society. Now, the Wheatleys failed to find subscribers to publish the book of Wheatley's poetry, perhaps a consequence of the rampant doubts of the authenticity of her work and the deteriorating political climate. With greater interest in London for poetry written by an enslaved African, the Wheatleys arranged for Phillis, then 18, to travel there in June of 1773 with Nathaniel Wheatley, the family's son, to promote the London publication of her book, Poems on Various Subjects. Now, in many ways, Wheatley was enmeshed in the same European networks of arts and letters as Jefferson. To the man who crafted the Declaration of Independence and designed Virginia's statehouse, Phillis Wheatley possessed the inferior traits of both her race and her gender. Despite her remarkable achievements under the harshest of circumstances, Jefferson observes and notes that Wheatley was incapable of writing poetry, since love for the Negro can only stimulate the senses, but not the imagination. And yet, in her poem on imagination, Wheatley proclaims, quote, "Soaring through the air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace, the thundering god," as a gesture of creative and conceptual play of a liberated subject. Channeling a proto-romanticist ethos, Wheatley reflects on the mind's capacity to sever the mental chains of captivity. And yet, in notes, Jefferson demeans Wheatley's poems to be, quote, "below the dignity of criticism," end quote. Jefferson sought to deny her poetry's efficacious engagement with his world of ideas. Otherwise, he would have to recognize her creative genius, her freedom of speech, and her humanities. And yet, nonetheless, Wheatley's skillful deployment of classicism entered seamlessly into the discourse of the newly forming revolutionary public sphere, helmed by Jefferson and the other founding fathers. One of the few 18th century American women to have been published, Wheatley used her public stature to advocate for both American independence and for the natural rights of those enslaved. Both Wheatley and Jefferson proclaimed slavery to be a morally corrupting force that must be ended. Wheatley, however, believed that freedom from enslavement for Africans must be a part of the revolutionary agenda, whereas Jefferson offered a gradual plan of emancipation and self-portation back to Africa. Wheatley sought liberation at the moment of political rupture to ensure that she, her family, and other enslaved Africans could live as free Americans. By contrast, Jefferson deferred emancipation in order to live off his investments in a slave-owning society. Now, upon return from her London book tour in July of 1773, Phillis Wheatley was freed by John Wheatley, who honored their agreement made prior to her journey. 5 years later, she married a free Black shopkeeper and laborer, John Peters. They moved often around Boston because financial security as free Blacks remained elusive. She bore children, though the number and their fate remain unknown. She also experienced intermittent bouts of ill health. A further blow, Wheatley failed to find a publisher for a second book of poetry and letters. She died indigent in Boston at age 31 on December 5th, 1784. Though 10 years older than Phillis Wheatley, Thomas Jefferson lived to the age of 83, whereas Jefferson left an astonishing record of 19,000 letters, and it's a lot of letters. Wheatley's legacy amounts to a mere 22 extant letters. Along with her poetry and letters, Wheatley did, however, leave one rare archival trace. Now, once Wheatley gained her freedom, like other free Blacks, the archival trail of legal documents, bill of sales, wills, and manumission papers disappeared, given the limitation on the ability of even free Blacks to acquire property and to seek legal redress. Domestic commodities and craft objects like furniture, fabric, and embroidery can be evidence of those whose lives do not readily appear in the archive. Thus, the only artifact believed to be owned by Wheatley is a convertible mahogany tea table desk dated to 1760. The table's flexibility and portability may have been ideal for the kinds of spaces Wheatley would have lived as a free Black person. Albeit a humble domestic object, the table's mahogany traveled the same transatlantic trade routes as the young captured girl who would be renamed Phillis Wheatley. The enclosure and theft of indigenous lands in the Caribbean by European colonists to establish plantations necessitated deforestation undertaken by crews of enslaved Africans. By the early 18th century, large quantities of mahogany served as ballasts in ships sailing from places like Barbados and Jamaica to furniture makers in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and London. So for Wheatley and Jefferson, ownership of mahogany furniture facilitated different degrees of utility and self-fashioning in the worlds of arts and letters, but also within the gendered and class spaces of culture and taste. And yet, for Wheatley, despite her tenacity, intellectual acuity, and creative insights into a world in which the precious freedom of the revolutionary moment was erected on the backs of the unfree, the unceasing violence of anti-Black racism that began in the abyss of the hold of the brigantine Phillis rapidly extinguished the poet Phillis's flight to her bright abode shortly after she had secured her own freedom. Okay, I'm almost done. So let us return to the Virginia State House's construction site to discern how it entwined freedom and captivity. Now, in later editions of notes, Jefferson records that by 1792, there was an almost equal number of enslaved Blacks and free whites living in Virginia. The population of freed Blacks had also grown as slaveholders liberated slaves after the Revolutionary War. And indeed, many recognized, if we are going to fight for freedom, it should be freedom for all. But those manumissions, like Wheatley's in Boston, began to taper off as the value of domestic slaves increased with the international slave trade being attacked by abolitionists like the Quakers in Philadelphia. Slave labor was indispensable for cultivating crops like wheat and cotton, which were becoming more popular as tobacco farming had exhausted the soil in the mid-Atlantic. Tidewater slave owners hired out enslaved workers to other plantations or as skilled workers in towns and cities. And so places like Richmond, where Jefferson's State House was under construction, teemed with enslaved and free Black artisans and laborers. Now, in 1785, Jefferson wrote from Paris to directors Hay and Buchanan that given the scarcity of talented craftsmen in Virginia, it might be wise to hire European craftsmen well-versed in wood, stone, and plastering techniques. Securing the services of a skillful stonecutter, for instance, was desirable because, according to Jefferson, in his letter to the directors, quote, under his, the stonecutter's direction, Negroes who never saw a tool will be able to prepare the work for him to finish, end quote. So once construction of Virginia's capital was underway, enslaved laborers joined the teams of workers, free and indentured, on Shockoe Hill. Now, it was also common for free white Virginians engaged in business and in trade, including construction, to possess a small number of enslaved men, women, and children. And indeed, William Hay, the director of public buildings in Richmond, for example, owned 6 slaves over the age of 16. Now, tax records only make note of those who are taxable, so there could have been children. Samuel Doby, a skilled Richmond builder who executed Jefferson's design, though not always faithful to the architect's intent, owned 2 adult slaves during the time of construction. Many of the tradesmen, plasterers, plumbers, and painters who worked on the Virginia Capitol owned several slaves. Edward Voss and his sons of Culpeper, the supplier of 400,000 bricks for the building's foundations, walls, and columns, owned 7 slaves. To perform numerous rough carpentry and woodworking tasks for several years through 1795, Samuel Doby contracted Dabney Minor, who lived on a farm in Woodlawn in nearby Orange, Virginia, where he owned 7 slaves and kept 10 enslaved workers in Richmond. Minor's arrangement exemplifies the connection between rural regions where raw materials were cultivated and towns where commodities and goods, including slaves, circulated in and out of markets. Now, during the busy year of 1789, Minor's workers erected the interior framing of the courtroom and doorways, laid tongue and groove flooring in the courtroom, mounted scaffolding for workers to install the pediments and the cornices. They moved bricks, and they also cut the wooden templates so that Voss's enslaved workers could erect the building's exterior columns. And this was all part of a long list for which Minor was paid, but not his slaves. Now, because Richmond was a port town, free Black men also worked on the Capitol building site. Known to Hay and Doby was a laborer named Fortune, who may have been a freeman named Louis Fortune. Fortune was paid directly, indicating that he might either be a freedman or an enslaved laborer who had some modicum control over his time. Fortune worked on the construction sites for several months in 1788, his task including clearing away timber and planks and rubbish from the yard. Black workers provided a significant portion of the labor necessary to erect Jefferson's monument to American civic life. And as I will explore in the next lectures, enslaved and free Black workers were enlisted to build Washington City, its civic buildings, where they joined a host of domestics, hostlers, draymen, who maintained the houses and the banks and the taverns that prospered in the city's first decades. Now here is another of Latrobe's exquisite watercolors taken from across the James River a few years after the Virginia state capitol was completed. It depicts the civic temple dominating the rustic landscape, much in the way that Jefferson's Monticello and the universities of Virginia commanded their respective sites. And these 2 other designs, the high ground, both natural and man-made, provided Jefferson with the opportunity to architecturally reconcile the paradox between freedom and slavery by placing some of the slave dependencies beneath the main living spaces in rooms and passages hidden from view. This way, the white columned neoclassical building appeared to visitors as idyllic beacons of democratic values overlooking a sublime natured, unsullied by the presence of those spaces in which unsightly slaves toiled to make the land fertile and the lives of citizens comfortable. Now, to conclude, Jefferson in Query 14 lamented that Blackness was a sublime, quote, eternal monotony, end quote, and, quote, a movable veil of black which covers all of the emotions of the other race, end quote. For Jefferson and for others of his era, blackness and black subjects proved an impenetrable threshold to reason. Wielding the tools of an enlightenment, they rationalized that black peoples belonged at the tail end of the social and political forces that would advance so-called American civilization. In the same manner that Jefferson designed their spaces of interminable servitude below ground. While all men were born equal, as natural rights proponents vociferously advocated, the Negro possessed neither the aptitude to reason nor the faculties to fully appreciate liberty and beauty. The prospect for free Black Americans like Wheatley or Louis Fortune to join we the people was both unreasonable and unimaginable to the sage of Monticello and to many others. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for being with us this afternoon, and I hope you join us over the next 3 Sundays. So enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and thank you for being with us.